top 10 takeaways. Oh, offensive line takeaways. Oh, yes, offensive line. That matters. We talk about that all the time. But now we have an actual expert today. I'm going to bring him in right now. His name's Dan Fornek. He's going to be analyzing offensive lines for PlayerProfiler this year for us. He's going to have an article coming out periodically. He's going to be updating the offensive line rankings in our ranking service every other week. Here he is. What's up, Dan?
Hey, Matt. Hey, Matt. How you doing?
I am excited to talk about offensive line. I talk about it all the time. We talk about it in the NFL draft analysis constantly on our draft kit, the world-famous draft kit. We have the team insights, and we devote a significant portion of the team insights to discussing offensive line changes and tracking players added, players lost, not just in the skill positions. This one really matters, but it's difficult to quantify. So we're going to go through team by team, talk about teams that are improving, talk about teams that are falling behind, or they're either suffering injuries, talent's been degraded, whatever it is. And we'll try to decode how you can use that information with fantasy football. But before we do that, let's talk about your bona fides a little bit. So to be an offensive line analyst, how do you get to that position? Give us a little bit of your background.
So, for me, I was way back in high school. This has been a long time ago now, unfortunately. I was a very middling tight end. One of those people who I had like weird growth spurts as a kid. So, I was that kid that was like 5'2" in the third grade and all that stuff. And so, I was always an athlete, but I never understood how it worked. So I would, they stuck me at tight end and they're like, you could run some routes and block some guys. And okay, great. Like, didn't start playing football till I was in high school because my parents would have always had to like play me up a level. So I was that big kid that was a little too awkwardly big, but was lucky enough to get an opportunity to play at the University of Dayton. And when I get there, they said, we're running a spread offense and you're not fast. So we're going to go ahead and put you on the offensive line. And so worked my way up and ended up being a 3-year letterman there. Started from the last 2 years I was there at a left guard, played some right guard. And then naturally, when you're not good enough to make it to the next level, if you're, you want to be around the game, you start coaching a little bit. So I've coached around the Chicago suburbs back where I'm from. I've coached 8 years out in Indianapolis and all sorts of positions, offensive line, running back, wide receiver. And so for me, my background is in English. I was an English teacher and I enjoyed reading and writing. So I was always consuming fantasy content. And it just kind of felt like, well, I think I can do this. Like, I think I can see things a little bit different from a playing background. I think I can like be part of, this community. So took a unpaid website job for a couple of years, writing up matchups, writing up DFS. Then around COVID, when school went virtual, I found myself with a little bit more time. And so I saw a posting for Rotoballer and they were looking for a writer. So I gave it a shot and ended up getting that. And then kind of when I was there, it was one of those moments where it's like, as I look at the landscape and there's so many people who are way more talented than I am in terms of analysis. My background's not in math, but it was like, well, offensive line seems like it's underrepresented. Like there's just not much covering it. And I know at least what I'm looking at when I watch a game. So maybe I could try something in this space a little bit. And that's kind of been what's helped me go. I mean, it was one of the things I write for FTN as well. I started with them last year. And it was one of those things where that was what caught their eye. And then all of a sudden Theo comes, reaching out to me and asking if I'm interested in doing the same thing for you guys, just a little bit different. And it's like, yeah, that'd be great. So here we are, just keep falling upward.
No surprise that Theo found you. Theo has his hands in so many things and he sees all, reads all. He's the all-consuming Theo. Like he gets it. He knows what's going on. He has his finger on the pulse of the industry more than I do, unlike anyone. And so I'm so glad that he introduced us. And so just to be clear, you weren't quite Adam Troutman level Dayton tight end athlete.
No, I was a preferred walk-on who rose through the ranks and grinded his way to the top, which at that point the top is like starting for an FCS team, and then
Yeah.
you just disappear into the night.
Well, how much weight did you have to add? Because to go from tight end to guard, you got to add what? You're looking at 40 pounds at least?
Oh, so I was that tall, skinny kid. So when I was playing wide receiver, I probably looked more like a wide receiver. So when I went to college, I weighed 210 pounds. And by my final year playing, I was up to 305.
So
I put on
95 pounds then.
about 95 pounds in 5 years. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, okay. In 1 year, what was the most you gained in 1 year? About 40 pounds?
There was a year where I put on about 55.
Yeah,
It was
there you
an
go.
off
You
season.
did it. You didn't put
It was
on
well,
50
and part
pounds.
of it.
The year you had to make the leap, you had to just add so much weight.
I had to add a 6-year-old to my body, and then we just kind of went from there.
What did you do? How did you add all those calories?
It was so a lot of times when you're a skill guy and you go to college, they may put you on, we want you to play at this weight. So like, here's a dietary and nutrition structure. For me, they were like, do you have an unlimited food card? And it was like, yeah. And they're like, okay, if you're not in class, you're eating. And then it was in the summers, finding my way into weight room 2-3 times a day. But it was funny because when I was in high school, I was so uncoordinated. Like I would do something that I guess was abnormal, and the coaches would be like, oh yeah, this guy could be a guy. And then the next play I would just like trip and fall over my size 17 shoes. And they'd be like, okay, maybe he's not. And then for whatever reason in college, it all just kind of clicked. Like I was like, oh, like this is how, if I want to do this, this is what I need to do. And, I went from, being occasionally able to dunk a basketball to dunking at 305. All of my like speed and explosion metrics got better. So at 305, I was running a sub 540, and nobody knew how. And I got steroid tested a lot, but I always passed. So it was okay.
What? Whoa. So you might have even had like visions of going to the NFL at that point. If you run a sub 4.540 at guard. At 300 pounds?
It was a sub 5. It was
Sorry. What I say? Sub 540. Yeah, sub 540.
Yeah. If I was doing that, I think
no. Sub 540 is a big deal for any 300 pounder. Sub 540 is a big deal.
Yeah, but now we use those skills in Sunday flag football leagues, so that's okay.
I know, but I'm just saying. At one point, you must have been looking at yourself going, "I think maybe let's see what happens." It's not the craziest thing, man. There's been walk-ons that have gone to schools in the MAC and have gone on to the NFL.
There may have been a contract offer out there to play some ball in Europe, but that whole situation. Well, another day we can have that conversation because that story is far too long for one podcast.
And we have a whole podcast dedicated to breaking down the various offensive line positions, how they impact fantasy points. That's coming up with Dan Fornek after this. Hey, people always ask me, what's the World Series of Fantasy? What's the Super Bowl of Fantasy? And it's easy. It's the FFPC. Their signature Players Championship has a $6 million prize pool. And their best ball leagues start in February. And they're the answer to so many questions. Hey, what's the best place to get a Dynasty Orphan? Well, you can adopt a Dynasty Orphan at the FFPC right now. There's more orphans at the FFPC than anywhere else on the internet. That's why we partner with them. So if you want to play fantasy football for low, medium, high stakes, you love Dynasty, you love best ball, you love seasonal leagues, all types of fantasy footballers need to go to the FFPC. And remember, use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you $25 off your first team. Promo code Underworld, $25 off your first team, no matter what the format is, at the FFPC. Go get it. Now, I have a lot of questions. Well, 10. Top 10 takeaways, top 10 offensive line takeaways requires at least 10 questions about offensive lines. So let's just talk about the positions. Go through the 5 positions and just talk briefly about what makes them special, what you look for to determine, hey, this guy's a good guard, this guy has some weaknesses. Lay it out for us.
So we'll start with the most important one. It's your left tackle. And I'll say that with the like asterisk that as the NFL becomes more pass heavy, both tackles kind of matter, especially, like for example, with the Miami Dolphins, the right tackle is probably more important because Tua is a left-handed thrower. So that's your blindside blocker. That's the guy where the quarterback isn't looking, and he has to trust that you're taking care of his back. With your left tackle, those guys are big, but they also have to be athletic because they're going to face the more athletic edge rushers more often than not. I would say your second most important guy is your center. A lot of times he'll be the one in the box sitting there saying, hey, this is the guy who we're setting our protection to. This is where we have to go. He's kind of like the communicator among everybody. And that's why a lot of times you'll see the quarterback come up and before even in the shotgun, they'll talk to the center and point to someone because they're telling him, make sure your guys are going here, or that's the guy that I'm expecting to be unblocked. So, we'll figure it out from there. He'd be the hot guy at that point, the hot read. Your right tackle, traditionally, those guys are a bit bigger. They're a bit slower, and they're going to be your people movers. But again, as the NFL becomes more pass heavy, those positions are getting a bit more balanced. And then really guards, you're looking at short area quickness, because a lot of times guards are protected outside and inside. They have a guy to the left, they have a guy to their right. So in terms of NFL, they're kind of more interchangeable. A very good guard is a good thing to have. But if you're going to lose a guy along the offensive line, you'd want it to be a guard because you can help cover for maybe a worse backup with your center or your tackle.
Right. You can just you can narrow the distance that they have to cover in right. the interior. That's really what you're doing. Now, what about these pairings? How important is the pairing where sometimes we'll say, okay, we're intentionally putting our best guard next to our left tackle because we want strength on, maximize our strength on the left side, and we're going to have our two weakest guys on the right side. What's the thinking behind that strategy?
It would depend on your scheme. So if you know that you have an exceptional left guard, left tackle, you're going to run more of your run plays that way. You're going to kind of move maybe your pass coverages opposite. So on any given play, most teams are going to bring 4 defenders or 5 to try and get to the quarterback because you still need to have people in coverage. So having a very good left side allows you to allocate more resources. You could send the center to the right to help the guard. You can attach a tight end or a running back to kind of chip as they go. So having one side that's dominant just means that you have more resources you could put on the weak side, and you can make up for the lack of skill with numbers.
And it simplifies everybody's role too, because you remember with football, there's just constant chaos. And if you know this area of the field is taken care of, then in the moment, the running back knows, okay, I'm probably going to be looking on my right periphery, right? In terms of a wide receiver coming across, going to be cracking back, on the right side, helping on the right side. The tight end's going to usually end up on the right side. Those kinds of things. Yeah, they're tendencies that the other team can pick up on, but it's like, okay, our tendencies. We keep the thing simple, and then some of the more complicated stuff, once the play is underway, we weren't devoting a lot of extra bandwidth to thinking about the beginning of where we need to be. We know this area of the field is taken care of. That little extra layer of simplification, and that's what happens when you create epicenters of strength. And I like whenever you have team sports creating epicenters of strength, where that's the whole notion of the triangle systems, where we have an epicenter of strength where we know we can focus our attention on this area, we can focus all of our strategy and tactics around this area, also knowing that we're good over here, right? Like that guy's not part of the triangle. We know if we throw it to him, we pass it to him, he's going to hit that 3-pointer. We just know that. That's something we can set our watch by. So you have certain things on the field you can set your watch by. Other things where there's uncertainty, where there's weakness, that's where you can focus your attention. So I think that's also part of that strategy as well. Now, where do you see offensive line impacting fantasy football the most?
So I think it'll impact different positions in different ways. Like as a general overarching, one of the things you always want to look for in an offensive line is continuity. The best offensive lines year to year have the most returning players. And it runs kind of counterintuitive because it's like, well, everyone's a year older, so they're less effective. But realistically, at the offensive line, you're handling your job as a unit. So if you're the left tackle on any given play, you know your job, but you also know what the left guard is doing and the center is doing because everything kind of moves in unison. So the teams that have guys who've been playing together the longest are going to operate at a higher level because you don't have to think. You hear the play, you're like, okay, this is the picture I have, this is what I see. And based on what I see, I think, the left guard is going to do a certain thing. The center might do something because maybe it's a different look. Maybe it's something we practiced all week. So I trust that everyone around me is going to do the right thing. And then, as another general thing, it's penalties. Penalties take points off the board, both in NFL and fantasy. So you want to have these experienced units because the ones who maybe have weak links, the ones who have a bunch of young guys, or maybe they're trying to develop somebody, you're probably going to see more penalties because maybe they're getting used to the speed of the game, or maybe something they did in college doesn't happen at the NFL level as much anymore. But in terms of fantasy scoring, offensive line, doesn't score points. So for your fantasy scoring positions, it really impacts the quarterback. And for that, you're looking at like sack rate and pressure rate. Quarterback operates on time. That they have an expectation of this wide receiver is going to be in this place at this time. So as they're going through their progressions, they're looking and they're expecting something. Well, if a defensive lineman is in their face, that time speeds up and maybe the ball flutters a little bit. Maybe they throw it short. Maybe they have to just get it off to a hot read and just dump the ball off and try and get any positive yardage. And so sacks and pressures have that impact, and that's quarterback and wide receiver. If you're a deep vertical threat on a team with a terrible offensive line, you're going to be running wind sprints every week because he's not going to have time to get you the ball down the field. And then for running back, I look for yards before contact. I think that's your strongest metric. A guy like Kenneth Walker, you get him going downhill, he's really good. He was a home run hitter, but he had just as many negative plays behind the line last year because their interior wasn't the strongest, and it was boom or bust. So the better your offensive line, the further the running back is getting hit down the field, which means the more time he has to like build up momentum and make those big plays.
So let's say there's an injury, and that's really when we as analysts get activated, because then it's like, okay, things have changed. We actually have something that we can talk about, analyze, and make, some actionable decisions on. Left tackle gets injured. To me, that's easy. We know that's going to impact the quarterback. It's going to impact the deep ball passing, most likely. The reason why I think that's the most straightforward in where offensive line play impacts fantasy football is because most teams only have one left tackle that's any good, and a lot of teams have zero. And the idea that a team would have two is typically far-fetched. So when you go down the roster and you go down the depth chart, if you lose a guard, you can't just automatically assume that's going to impact the running game significantly, because the backup guard might be, like you talked about, not a nominal downgrade, and it's more of the unit doing the work anyway, and there may be no difference. So the assumptions you can make are change based on the position and based on the quality and the differential between the guy on the top of the depth chart and the guy just below him, and the dynamics involved. Now, the overall quality of the offensive line, though, the overall unit, their ability to work together to create running lanes really matters for running backs. But that's not an individual. That's as a unit. And so that's what I love about the work you're going to be doing for us, the articles you're going to be putting out, and the spots you're going to have on our podcasts, is you're going to be able to talk about the unit as a whole and how it's impacting the running game, but also specific events that might happen, most notably injuries on offensive lines, and typically how that impacts the passing game. And you'll be able to break that down because you're going to understand these depth charts and know, hey, this team is deep here, so this injury actually isn't what it was sold to be right? By the
Right.
the general media sort of panic about this is not warranted, or the opposite. This is actually a big deal nobody's talking about, right? So that's part of why you're here, is that we really need this level of deep analysis to help people take their fantasy games to the next level. Is there anything else that, from what I said, that you would build on?
I mean, that's pretty much all. That pretty much encompasses it. And obviously, that's not to say there aren't, guards in the league. If Dallas loses, um, Zach Martin week one, that's going to have a significant impact on everything around the team. You scheme up these plays in the NFL at any level around your best players. So if like we were saying earlier, this side of the line is very strong. Well, maybe that's where you run certain concepts, because those two are going to get the movement you need, and everything behind the play maybe doesn't, matter as much, because in your head that, okay, Tony Pollard is going to be able to beat anyone coming from the backside. So that doesn't matter as much. Let's just run behind, Zach Martin, because we know what he's going to do every single play. So losing a guy like that on the inside is significant, but really mostly your guards are kind of interchangeable pieces.
And it's interesting too. That's another piece, is that, let's say you lose a guard, lose a right tackle. Well, don't forget, offensive coordinators are going to make adjustments. They're going to change their play calling. They're going to change their protections. So they're going to have a whole week of practice to get ready to change the way they do things, so that it's not as much of a hindrance as, again, it might appear on the surface. And so it's critical that we follow these units over time, week in, week out, update our rankings accordingly, and how efficient they are, the yards they're creating for running backs, the protection rates that they're providing to quarterbacks. These are metrics that we have on PlayerProfiler.com, and these go into the offensive line rankings. But it requires a couple weeks to really assess this fully, and what is the actual impact of Zach Martin going down. It's a great example where I see and observe how the scheme has shifted, what adjustments are being made, and maybe there are no adjustments that can be made. Maybe it's just is such an important piece that, it ends up hurting Tony Pollard, and that's a great example of something that we would be talking about most likely more than other services. Just like we have talked more about this Teron Armstead injury, because it was not a season-ending injury, and he's likely to miss a couple weeks. He's questionable for week one. No one knows what that means, exactly when he's going to be back. So everyone just throws their hands up in the air and says, well, I know it matters, but I'm not sure how much it matters, so I can't really change my ranking or assessment of a Jalen Waddle or anyone like that. It is interesting, though, when you look at Jalen Waddle, where his rookie year, Tua had no time to throw, so his target depth was under 10 yards. Then Tua suddenly had time to throw with Teron Armstead, and just the overall improvement of the offensive line. Next thing you know, Jalen Waddle's target depth almost doubles. And it's like, whoa, right? That's the best example of, hey, how does an offensive line and changing of personnel and changing of scheme, how can that impact a player's performance? Now, it ended up not impacting his fantasy production much, because he put up the same fantasy points just on a lot fewer targets, because he was a lot more efficient. But it also brings up a possible concern, where if Tyreek Hill is there and the offensive line is not as good, then it's impossible for the second receiver to be that efficient and put up the kind of fantasy production, wide receiver one type fantasy production, that people that have Jalen Waddle have been accustomed to. So when you look at this Teron Armstead injury, what goes through your mind, knowing the Miami offensive line and where their weaknesses are and what Armstead means to that unit?
Well, it's interesting. So last year we had a very similar situation with this play out over the beginning of the year. And so it's actually kind of good, because you get to see, the emerging trends when you start, and then, one by one, they lost Tua, and then the next week Armstead got injured. So in the first 4 weeks last year, Miami's EPA per play, they were second in the NFL, weeks 1 through 4. Um, their offense was successful. They were gaining yards. They were gaining them in chunks. Their drop back success rate, they were ranked third. But like their rushing success rate was middle of the pack. They were 21st because we have all these explosive pieces on the perimeter, and we're going to trust that Tua can get them the ball where we need him to because he's protected. He has time. He's in the pocket. And, during that time, they're averaging almost 25 points a game. And so they were more run than pass heavy in their first 4 games. They threw the ball 35 times per game and they rushed the ball 20 times per game, which is what you would expect. We're healthy. We have our quarterback. We have a solid offensive line. And then week 4 is the week that Tua goes down and Skylar Thompson gets inserted in. Now, and this is where this gets kind of complicated because we now have a variable where the quarterback got hurt. So you expect the entire offense to come back down a little bit because the guy who's your number one quarterback isn't the one delivering the but what you saw during that time was they dropped all the way EPA per play to 24th. Their drop back success rate went down to 20th, which makes sense because you have a late round rookie in the backfield who doesn't know what he's seeing. So he's going to be less successful throwing it. But they shifted a little bit and their rushing success in that week was second in the NFL. So they said, we're going to help our young quarterback out. We're just going to hand the ball off. Their run pass split changed. They passed it 34 times. That was the week against the Jets. They ran the ball 26 times and they scored just 17 points. So they were a touchdown worse, but they were carrying the ball 6 more times a game. So they ran more plays because, they were handing the ball off. And then in week 6, we get the perfect storm. There is no Tua. There is no Teron Armstead. They're playing the Minnesota Vikings, which is not a great defense collectively, but they had really good edge rushers. You have Danielle Hunter. You had Zadarius Smith. So you have these top tier guys, and they have Teddy Bridgewater under center. And then that was the game where kind of the wheels fall off. So their drop back, they stuck at 20th. They were still just 45%, but now with an experienced quarterback who's seen NFL action before, but their rushing success plummeted all the way to 24th. And so in that week, nothing was working because you lost your quarterback, but also you lost your left tackle who, one of the most valuable things in the NFL you can have on the offensive line is a guy you could leave on an island. Teron Armstead, we don't need your help. Like, you just handle your guy and let us figure out how these other 4 or 5 guys are going to execute the other side of the play. Well, when you don't have that, it just puts stress on everybody else. And while this is all happening, Miami lost their right tackle the first game of the season. So now they're down 2 tackles and trying to fill it in and figure it out the best they can. And, week 6 is when we really saw that offense probably at its low point against a defense that they should have been able to exploit.
Minnesota, 10 targets for Jalen Waddle. He had 17 fantasy points. He was the wide receiver 14. His best week, can you guess his best week of the year? Jalen Waddle's best week?
I'm going to go ahead and assume it was in those first 4 weeks because he had a healthy Tua and a healthy Armstead.
Yeah, it was. Baltimore, he had 40 points.
Yeah.
He had 19 targets, 171 air yards. He had 4 red zone targets. He was amazing. And so first 3 weeks of the season, Waddle had 15-plus fantasy points, including a 40-point week. And then he was very volatile after that. So 5 points, 16 points, 12 points, 30 points, 5 points, 2 points, 13 points, 5 points, 8 points, 20 points, and on down the board. That's the story, man. And it's interesting where, okay, we lost our quarterback, but because we have our offensive line mostly intact, we can at least use the guys we have to lean on the running game. But then once we lose our quarterback and our left tackle, suddenly we don't have the resources, like you said, to push anyone forward in the running game, and the passing game's not working, and then the whole offense fails. So that's a great sort of illustration of it's tricky though, because the losing Tua, it really was mostly put on Tua's shoulders, or the Tua injury. Hey, this is the reason why this offense is struggling so much, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And then you saw the running game, like we talked about. The running game really suffers when the entire collective unit is degraded, and that's exactly what happened. Now, which offensive line do you believe is going to be the most improved from last year to this year? Because that's also exploitable for fantasy football. If we can find a couple offensive lines that are improving the most.
I think there are two that stand out at this point in time. One of them is the New York Giants. Last year, it was the unit was okay, but they invest a top 10 pick in Evan Neal, and you just expect him to plug and play and everything to be okay. But that transition for him from left tackle to right tackle just didn't take very well. He had some good weeks, and part of it is you have to look at it through the lens of he's facing the Eagles twice, and they just have an army of edge rushers that they're trotting out after him. They faced Dallas twice, so those are plays where he's facing Micah Parsons and DeMarcus Lawrence. So there's a asterisk that goes there. That's a rough transition for any player. It doesn't matter if you're a top 10 pick or an undrafted free agent. But I've been back and watching him, and it was a lot of his was kind of technique, and it kind of makes sense because when you're on the left side of the line for your college career, you get used to, okay, on this play, this is where I need to be, so this is how I'm going to get there. Well, when you move to the right side, you basically have to operate in a mirror. Everything that I know, I have to now flip. So if I was taking this step with my left foot, it has to be my right. If I'm looking here, it has to be here. With offensive line, you have to be comfortable operating going backwards, because if you're pass setting, you're moving backwards. Well, your angles, your everything changes. So if he can make the leap that I would expect, they're going to have a top 3 left tackle, which is what Andrew Thomas has become. You hope that Evan Neal becomes, a top 10 right tackle this year, and now you're set in those places.
Hell yeah.
And then in this draft class, you upgraded your center. You took John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota, who's
Loved it.
probably
Love
the best.
The pick,
yeah.
Man. How is John Michael Schmitz from Minnesota not a hell of a pick in the second round? How is that not just the obvious chalk pick to make? Oh, baby.
And he could have been the pick at 25, and it would have been like, okay, I understand that. Like we saw it with Tyler Linderbaum last year. You plug a guy in, and it just solidifies. And now if he's what you think he is, he's identifying everything and getting all of your pieces in the right places, which is only going to help the offense be better. And they have some experience depth. They have guys who on the inside and the outside who aren't starters, but have played in this league. So, if Andrew Thomas has to come out for half of a game, you're going to insert Tyree Phillip more, and he's at least seen NFL action. He knows what's going on. So he's not going to be overwhelmed in the moment. He's a professional. So I think they have some players in place that could mitigate any injuries up front, at least within a reasonable doubt.
That's incredible. Now, when I am evaluating NFL draft picks, I look at the bookends, like who was picked one before and one after, and then assess your pick. So the Giants take John Michael Schmitz. It's just amazing. And then Buffalo, 2 picks later, took Osiris Torrance, who was a developmental tackle, but a lot of potential. Could move to guard. Who knows, right? Mm-hmm. Either way, a lot of potential. Between Schmitz and Torrance, the Cowboys select Luke Schoonemaker, who is not going to be anything, right? And it was buried throughout the summer and had, just the job was ready for him. They let Dalton Schultz go, and he's like, you know what? I don't think it's going to happen, right? And all the beat reporters are coming out early saying, listen, the job is Ferguson's. It's going to Ferguson. Schoonemaker is not going to be ready. Schoonemaker may never be ready. Peyton Hendershot's going to get more snaps than Schoonamaker. And when you go back and you look, and it's like, yeah, this was one of those drafts where there was some incredible talent all the way down to the end of the second round at offensive line, and that's not always the case. There just happened to be a lot of depth at a lot of these positions, and if you weren't tapping such a rare event where those kinds of players are available in the late second round, if you were going other positions there, that was a mistake. Anyway, do you have another one, maybe? Another offensive line that you think is improving?
I have. So this will be my dark horse one, and people will come at me for being a homer, but that's okay. I really liked what the Bears did and how they intentionally tried to rebuild their weaknesses. Last year was a lost cause. We need to see what Justin Fields can do with, JV, Equinemius St. Brown, and Dante Pettis trying to catch passes. And so they were able to establish, okay, our offensive line, we found a couple nice pieces. Braxton Jones he was a rookie and he played really well for a late round pick. And so we have a left tackle we feel comfortable with.
I mean,
Tevin
what
Jenkins,
kind of home run is that though? I mean, that is just a master stroke of a draft pick. When you have a late round guy that can perform well as a rookie tackle in the NFL, isn't that like a once every couple years event?
Absolutely. And just think of how it probably impacted their thinking in this year's draft. If you have a giant hole at left tackle, this was a class where you could attack that. There was Paris Johnson, there was Peter Skronsky, depending on how you see him. There was Broderick Jones. Like, you had three guys who kind of cleared themselves out and established themselves as the top guy. Well, if you're picking one and you can't afford to miss on these guys. So you're more likely to stay at one, and it just changes the entire draft.
Oh my God.
But instead, you're able to say, okay, Braxton Jones, who's a guy we took last year and we really like, we want to see more of him. He was, if you look at PFF, of all the rookie tackles last year, he was the top graded one. He played at the highest level. And so it changes their entire draft, because now they don't have to sit at one or maybe take less back to move to 3 or 4 or 5 or wherever they think that first tackle is going to come off the board. They can move back to 9 and then back to 10 and still get Darnell Wright, who is the best offensive lineman in this class, to fill their need. And then they go out into free agency and they bring in Nate Davis, and he's been hurt throughout the summer. So it shouldn't be anything that costs him time to start the year. But now you can take Tevin Jenkins, who you found was good, and you move him to left guard. So you've fortified your inside, and you take last year's left guard, Cody Whitehair. His best season in the NFL was when he was playing center. He's been a guard by necessity the past few years. And so now your entire unit 1 through 5 is stronger, and you have depth in Larry Borum, who was a guy who was another late round rookie who played a couple years ago. He got replaced by Braxton Jones. And then you have Lucas Patrick, who you acquired in free agency last year, and he can be a guard or a center depending on who goes down.
This is Anand and I talk about this on the Decision Point all the time. It doesn't matter if you like your current offensive linemen, just keep drafting them. And then what happens is it pushes a starter into a swing position, and now all of a sudden you have depth, and there are going to be injuries, and there are going to be games lost because offensive linemen get hurt. We just talked about this with the Miami-Minnesota game. So it really matters. If you are trying to impact wins and losses, and especially if you're in the second round, and there are first-round offensive line talents, just draft them. And the next thing you know, like you said, it's not only that you have depth, but players that were playing out of position in previous years all get to play their more preferred positions. And it just, everything clicks into place. So you think the Bears, wow. So for Roschon Johnson, this is big. Khalil Herbert, early in the season, big. For Justin Fields, this is big. Justin Fields getting a massive offensive line upgrade. Justin Fields getting a massive wide receiver upgrade. Justin Fields going into his third year, having now experienced a lot of what the NFL defenses can throw at him. Justin Fields, I just want to say Justin Fields. Can I just say Justin Fields? Justin Fields, it's an offensive line show with fantasy implications. Justin Fields, Justin Fields, Justin Fields. Let's talk about the offensive lines that you think are degrading year over year.
So for this one, the last year, the quintessential example, I think, to me was the Indianapolis Colts. In 2021, I had a couple guys get injured, Quentin Nelson, Ryan Kelly. They struggled to bounce back a little bit. They had to let some experienced guys go. Mark goes over to the Giants. So now you're opening up a hole at right guard. Chris Reed, the guy who was backing him up, they let him go too. And so, but you look and it's like, well, they still have Nelson. They still have Kelly. They still have a right tackle, Braden Smith. Like, they have three good positions. If they could get Bernhard Raymond at left tackle, if he can solidify, that'll be good for them. So you go in optimistic. They probably were universally seen last year as a top 10 offensive line. And then Raymond struggles. Nelson and Ryan Kelly just don't look the same. And you even see some of that in this preseason. They're struggling to get movement. They're getting knocked back more on passing plays than you would expect. And so, and then they had bad right guard play. So the teams that worry me this year, fast forward a year, I'm worried about the Dallas Cowboys, because you have several players on that offensive line that have injury histories, and you don't have the depth to replace. Now, going into the year, you hope, and all you could work with is the information in front of you. And right now, their five guys are healthy. And if their five guys can stay healthy, they're going to be a formidable unit. But get another injury to Tyron Smith, get another injury, to Zach Martin, and all of a sudden you may be looking at a team that's struggling to open up lanes. And then the other one, and this is more self-inflicted, is Kansas City. You win a Super Bowl, that's the ultimate goal. The whole point is to win. And then you let both of your left tackle and your right tackle walk in free agency. Now, your interior three guys are really good. They're all top five guys. You have Creed Humphrey, who was last year's top-rated center. You have Trey Smith, who took a step back last year, but still very good. And you have Joe Thuney on the left side. And so those three are fine. But you bring in Donovan Smith, who is old and really struggled last year in an offense where Tom Brady was getting the ball out fast, and he was still giving up pressures and still giving up sacks. And then you bring in Jawan Taylor, who just hasn't really ever had a season where it's like, okay, this guy is a premier right tackle. And so this is a unit. Now, Patrick Mahomes may be impervious to offensive line problems. There have been numerous times where something could manifest and he's getting the ball out or, spinning and throwing it over his head 50 yards and someone's just waiting there to catch it in the end zone. But that's a unit where if Creed Humphrey goes down, if Thuney goes down, if Smith goes down, now you might have some problems because your tackles just aren't as good as they have been in years past.
Well, he struggled because of that in the Super Bowl against Tampa, right?
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, they lost to Tampa because their offensive line crumbled and he was under constant duress. And that was the worry this past year. And yet he goes out and he wins the Super Bowl on a high ankle sprain. That's not sustainable. Okay, that's just not sustainable. It's like this guy's a miracle worker. This guy's a magician. Okay, great. But every high-level athlete is susceptible to this. Tom Brady had a year where the entire offensive line crumbled around him, and then they lost to the Ravens in the playoffs, where they were projected to win it all. Like they were the favorite going in to the playoffs to win the Super Bowl. And then they got bounced. Like, oh, my God, it's a huge upset. Anyone that was paying attention was like, no. They had 4 out of their 5 starting offensive linemen hurt. All right, both tackles hurt. That's what's going to happen. He's going to have no time to throw. So that is the danger. That's why you don't want to be so crazy overexposed to Kelsey and Mahomes. Those stacks, those are your first 2 picks in a best ball draft. That's a little much, right? You want to be too exposed to that particular stack, because if the offensive line, it'd be one thing if they had invested in it and they divested in it because they had to pay Patrick Mahomes, but also it was a weird decision. It was a weird decision. I think that there's probably, if I had to guess what happened, there's probably some people in Kansas City that are enamored with Jamar Taylor or Jawan Taylor, and that's just they just thought, okay, this is not necessarily a 1-for-1 replacement, but this is good enough. So, what do you think of Taylor? Because that would be that if Taylor could take a step forward this year with Kansas City, if they think they can coach him up at right tackle, that may be all they need to do.
Yeah, Taylor, he's a good player.
He's only 25. Jawan
He's
Taylor's only 25.
Yeah, there's time for him left to grow, and part of it is, everything is a situation. There's context. So a lot of times we're like, well, this guy lost a developmental year because he was injured. Well, Jawan Taylor lost a very important developmental year because Urban Meyer was his head coach, and everything was a mess, and so you don't get good coaching, and so you lag behind. And he can take a step. And to be fair, he's replacing Andrew Wiley, who his greatest skill last year was he had just been in the room in Kansas City. So he knew his assignments, he knew his plays. So that's not going to be a massive drop off. And Taylor does still have some growth in him. The one that concerns me is Donovan Smith, because he's kind of been taken down over the years. And so to take Orlando Brown, who at times last year he gave up a lot of pressures, but he's still someone we think of as, in that top 10, top 12 left tackle area. Right. And you're going down to Donovan Smith, who by all accounts was one of the worst rated left tackles in the NFL, in an offense that, if the ball is coming out fast, the offensive line, your job is extremely easy because you don't have to block for that long. You just have to open up enough time for Tom Brady to find his read and throw it. Well, in Kansas City, they like to draw out plays a bit more. They have a quick strike, but they attack vertically because Patrick Mahomes can buy the time to get the ball down the field. So you may not see those big chunk plays as much this year because the timing is disrupted, or you may see Mahomes trying to move more. So I'm kind of curious to see if Donovan Smith can kind of bounce back a little bit, or if this is just what he is at this point, and age comes for us all and it's just his time.
We've got a Bears fan in the chat. Just full transparency, Harry Snowman's in the chat. Good morning, Harry. And he wants to remind us that Tevin Jenkins, Darnell Wright, and Cody Whitehair all dealing with injuries this preseason. So the offensive line in Chicago has been snake bitten so far. I know at least Tevin Jenkins is questionable for week 1. So that's a potential issue. But our larger point is 2 of these 3 guys will probably play week 1, and it can't get any worse, right? This is a team that is teed up to really exceed expectations when healthy, and I think that 2 of these injuries are likely just, hey, let's shut it down for the rest of preseason type injuries, not, oh, this is going to cost this guy a bunch of games, especially Darnell Wright. I think the addition of Darnell Wright is so huge for Chicago that it more than offsets maybe some lost games or some degraded health at, would say, Tevin Jenkins. What did you like so much about Darnell Wright?
He has the mentality that you're looking for in a right tackle. In the run game, he's firing off the ball. He's mean. You can tell he's moving people with a purpose, and it just shows in how quickly he's able to move. But then in pass protection, he is light on his feet. He's able to mirror. He's able to get his hands on people and keep them where they want. And he's doing this in the SEC, and he had experience. So it may have taken him a couple years to find his footing, but then that final season when he did, he was dominant. He was doing all the right things. He didn't give up any sacks last year in an offense that was throwing the ball. And we could all sit here and say, okay, Tennessee runs a gimmicky offense. That's why guys like Jalen Hyatt were dinged in the process, because you just don't know what he can do as a receiver. But if you're going to run that offense, those plays take time for, Jalen Hyatt to come free down the field. And so Darnell Wright was kind of, at first glance, he was one of those guys that Tennessee felt comfortable putting on an island. We're going to let you operate the way you do. But he also comes in, the team talked about how one thing that stood out to the Bears talked about, I apologize. One thing that stood out to them in his pre-draft process was his mentality. They put him through an extensive on-field workout and just kept throwing plays at him, and then would bring him to the board and have him talk through what he saw and what he was doing. And so, that stood out to them. And then he comes into summer camp and he's running his conditioning test. And by all accounts, he blows this conditioning test out of the water. Well, he talks about afterwards how he had the times that he needed to run, and he was looking at the wide receiver times, not the offensive line or the big skill, is what a lot of times we like to be called because we like to pretend we have skill too. He's running the wide receiver speed time. So you have someone who's 300 pounds running the conditioning test that your 185, 200-pound guys are doing, and he crushes it. So it's like that kind of stuff. He wants to be in the NFL. And so when you have a guy that you're picking a top 10 pick on, you want to be sure that he wants to be playing. And by all accounts, he put himself in a position where he's going to be on the field week 1 because he didn't have to miss time because he couldn't run the conditioning test.
That's why I like his chances of being out there week 1, even though he had an ankle injury in practice this week. Is there another young player? I mean, you talked about Braxton Jones. Can you name one more young player that you think is ready to take a big step forward this year and get that recognition?
We talked about Evan Neal earlier. He would be hopefully the guy I would expect, so I'll go a different way.
Well, with Evan Neal, I just want to say with Evan Neal, this is look at very closely, and I think it matters. Evan Neal, I think he wears glasses. I believe Evan Neal wears glasses, and any time an offensive lineman wears glasses, I'm very impressed, and I immediately think that they are awesome.
That's fair. No, that's the metric that matters. How much the aesthetic, we need to protect that as well.
I'm just saying, man, when you have a thinking man's offensive lineman, a guy who's studious, these are things that I look for. The glasses. Okay, give us one more.
I'll say I think one player that needs to take a leap this year is Kenyon Green, playing guard for the Houston Texans. He was a day 2 pick last year. He was a guy many expected as just a drop in, plug and play, and he really had his struggles. Well, you're hoping that this year, if he can take that step, you have Laramie Tunsil, who's in the conversation for best left tackle in the league. You have Titus Howard, when he's healthy, who's in the conversation as one of the big ascending, experienced veteran right tackles. And you need Kenyon Green to hopefully take that step because your center is going to be Juice Scruggs, who is a second-round pick this year out of Penn State. So if you're going to fortify the interior of that offensive line, you have Shaq Mason on the other side. So that helps. That gives you that veteran. But if Kenyon Green can also take a step, then Juice Scruggs has time to develop because you have 2 guards who can help him on the inside. Tunsil on an island. Howard will be fine on his own. So now we need to make sure this interior, because you have a rookie quarterback, and the worst thing you can get is pressure in your face. That's going to throw off your timing. It's going to throw off your reads.
But if Juice Scruggs is good and Kenyon Green takes a step forward, then this could be a top 3 offensive line because they have 2 of the best tackles in the league. They have one of the best tackle tandems.
This time next year, we might be talking about them in the top 5. If everything breaks their way and you get the necessary development and Juice Scruggs fits in the league, you have a unit that we could be talking about, in the same breath like we would the Atlanta Falcons. This team came out of nowhere and all of a sudden it shows that they're one of the best units last year. It could be next year. It could be Houston.
Give us your top 3. Your top 3 offensive lines, just your big 3.
So the first 2, I don't think are going to shock anybody. You have Philadelphia Eagles. They went into last year, best offensive line. They left last year, best offensive line. We're going to come into 2023 with the best offensive line. You have stellar tackles, Jordan Mailata, Lane Johnson. Landon Dickerson was a center at Alabama who's taken really well to left guard. And then Jason Kelsey, who is just apparently ageless, and he's just going to keep playing. Those 4, Mailata, Johnson, Dickerson, and Kelsey, combined to give up just 71 pressures and 7 sacks last year. So and it makes sense. Jalen Hurts, of course, he's got time to get the ball down the field. Look who's in front of him. And then
Jalen
this
Hurts
year,
over Patrick Mahomes. This is what I'm talking about. This is why in
right?
superflex, I'm going Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. I know, and it's just it's not necessarily an injury risk or an offensive line risk only position, but it's part of it. It's part of Jalen Hurts, especially in superflex, where there is no free agent pool of quarterbacks available. He is as close to failure proof as possible. And this is one of those reasons why. Okay, who else you got?
Number two, and last year I thought the gap between these two teams was significant. I thought it was the Eagles are your clear one. This year coming into the year, you have to have the Detroit Lions as number two. Because you have the young pieces. I know, shocking, right?
That's amazing.
That's part of the reason why Jared Goff is still in the league.
That's amazing. Good for them, man.
But you have Penei Sewell, who has developed into a top 10 right tackle. Taylor Decker isn't a top tier left tackle, but he's good enough to where you can trust him. Frank Ragnow is a top 5 center. They brought in free agency Graham Glasgow, who played center for Denver last year, and he just adds to the interior. Their right guard before the season last year got injured, and they were kind of rotating bodies to try and figure out who could take a step up. Well, okay, let's add in Graham Glasgow, and now we just are building that depth that we need in case someone does get hurt again.
They could have added even more depth though, but they decided to go middle linebacker and running back in the draft.
Yeah, the middle linebacker, it's the heartbeat, and then Dan Campbell's all about the heartbeat.
We can't have all the nice things. We all of us Lions fans. It could have been one of the most epic offensive lines. They had it in their hands. Okay, give us number 3. This is the sleeper.
So for me, number 3, I'm gonna go with Baltimore. I think the Ravens. You're looking at a team. So Ronnie Stanley's injuries the last couple of years, everyone knows he's struggled to stay on the field. When he gets on the field, he looks good, but he's just not there. But sometimes injuries create opportunity. And so what Baltimore has now is they have Patrick McCarry, who's their backup tackle. Well, he graded out better than Ronnie Stanley did this last season. So you have a depth player who got a lot of repetitions. He got to see a lot of things. He's a player who could play left or right. And so now you have experience in a place where you didn't. So if Stanley keeps suffering injuries, you're like, okay, we at least have that covered. Tyler Linderbaum came out of the gates. He showed that arm size doesn't matter. He was the 6th ranked center in PFF. Kevin Zeitler is a solid guard. So you have all these different pieces, and depth-wise, they have Patrick McCarry, Sam Mustipher, who was a starting center for the Bears for a long time, Ben Cleveland, who's been a starting guard for the Ravens. You have 3 guys at each position that have pro experience. So if you have an injury in the flow of a game, you're replacing NFL talent with NFL talent.
Oh, okay. So I get it, all right? It's quality and quantity in Baltimore. What about an offensive line that is top heavy, if they stay healthy, would be top 3. I'm thinking about a particular offensive line in Los Angeles, but you're the guy to assess this. Chargers, no. Top 3, no.
Chargers are a good. I worry about right tackle. I worry about Trey Pipkins. And in the past, they had the ability to kind of mitigate him a little bit because they had Storm Norton, who also wasn't good, but at least they could mix and match. And if one guy was,
how is he not good with a name like Storm Norton? What a great offensive line name.
The name gets you in the door, but unfortunately, sometimes the talent has to keep you there.
God damn.
I think the bigger one for me, I think there's one offensive line that worries me more than they do, and it's the Atlanta Falcons. They are a top 5 offensive line. Early in the offseason, I had them, as I'm going through my stuff, I think you could have made a case for number 2 or number 3. because everything they have, all these players, I think their entire offensive line has day one or day two draft capital. And it all clicked last year. Caleb McGarry was a top 5 tackle. Chris Lindstrom is graded as the number 1 guard. Drew Dahlman had his struggles at center, but he was surrounded by everyone else around him. And then you add Matthew Bergeron from Syracuse in the second round of the draft. He's a 3-year starter at tackle for them. He's more of a guard in the NFL. And this is a team that was coming in and they built off their biggest weakness.
Just to interrupt for a second.
Yeah, take it.
Just another reason where all else equal, if you're not exactly enamored 100% with a player in the second round and there are first-round talents there, Bergeron, we can go – there's a list of 100 guys drafted in the second round that could have been drafted in the first round, and we're just the chalk picks. But these GMs, they're like, oh, man, Rashee Rice looked good at the Senior Bowl, you know? We've got plenty of depth at center or guard. We don't, whatever. Like we're fine. No, man. No. Think about what you're saying. You're like, oh, they found this guy in the second round. It's like, yeah, of course. God, it just drives me nuts. This is why on NFL draft day, that's the thing that gets me the most worked up and just fired up. Why not solidify your power center and work your way out? You agree that is the way. And then time and time again, when you're analyzing, aren't you seeing the same trends where, geez, if this team had if they had just drafted that one more offensive lineman in the second round, everything would be different. But they decided to go with that wide receiver. They just had to have this guy. He ends up being Dwayne Eskridge and giving you nothing.
Well, and you even have last year, 2022, Seattle seemed to learn from that mistake, and they attacked tackle in the first 2 rounds, and all of a sudden, here we are a year later, and Geno Smith is fantasy viable, DK Metcalf. If you look on Underdog, every single offensive player, their ADP is exactly where it should be because they built the offensive line, and they continued to build it this offseason, and so unless Geno Smith gets hurt, it's hard to see a way that they don't succeed again.
So they could be top 5 then, Seattle.
They could be. Their guards are a little iffy. I think off the top of my head, they just missed my top 12 this year, which that article, you'll be able to hop on Player Profile. Let's check that out because you'll see where all these different teams are ranked and where they fit into at least the preseason of this upcoming year.
Yeah, let's take a quick look here. I think we can pull it up on the screen. There it is, everybody. There it is. The offensive line ranks from Dan Fornek, live published today. PlayerProfiler.com. Check out the articles. It's there. It's one of the best pieces you'll read all year. Thank you, Dan. Amazing stuff. Now, we have to talk about the bottom of this list, okay? So, the bottom of the list is terrifying. And just before we get to that, the fragility of the Atlanta offensive line is something that we need to mention because that's the assumption. The working assumption is it's going to be an excellent offensive line. Ritter's going to have time to throw. It's actually going to give him time to push the ball downfield to Pitts and London, and it's certainly going to be great for Bijan. It's already a fragile projection in Atlanta to figure out how they're going to score fantasy points to support those high ADPs, those early ADPs, given how few plays they're projected to run. So the math is already very squishy, and I believe unrealistic by most projections, unlike ours, which we're below consensus across the board on Atlanta for that reason, and it's all laid out in the draft kit accordingly. That's yet another risk factor, is that the offensive line is not what it was sold to be because they had the perfect environment last year for success. Something changes, an injury happens, and then suddenly that the lack of depth is exposed. But they are going to be a good offensive line. You have them in your top 12. Now, give us 2 or 3 offensive lines that you are really worried about?
The offensive line that I'm most concerned about is the Los Angeles Rams. And they were bad last year, and we saw how that went for Matthew Stafford. He missed most of the year. But when you look at them coming into this year, the only projected starter they have right now, that played more than 425 snaps last year was their right tackle, Rob Havenstein. That's it. Only one player played over 425 snaps on their offensive line last year. They did draft a second-round rookie, Steve Avila. He's arguably the best pass-protecting guard in this class, but that's it. Joe Noteboom's coming off the Achilles.
I have to say it. Second-round pick. Another great
Right.
pick. The one pick that they had in the first 2 rounds in the last 5 years, they actually did themselves a great service, and they just didn't overthink it, and they went offensive line. Bravo, Rams. But this is also part of the reason why I can't get fully behind Cam Akers. The math, based on how many plays they're going to run, and the touch distribution tells you Cam Akers is a value, and then I cannot get up for drafting him. Every time I go to draft him, I'm like, I'd rather have Rashad White. I'd rather have David Montgomery. I'd rather have Dameon Pierce. I'd rather have Dalvin Cook. And so I know that the top be there, but knowing he's not going to have any running lanes and that this is going to impact the offense overall and their ability to score points, fewer red zone visits, I just can't get there with Cam Akers.
Yeah, it's a tough one because, and you even have the Achilles, and yes, he played well last year, especially down the stretch. But what we know about the Achilles tendon injuries are they sap explosiveness. So if he's not going to be explosive and guys are going to be in his face the minute he gets the ball, yeah, he's going to have volume. He's, arguably, unless you want Kyron Williams out there running a 4.740, like he is going to have the volume, but just because he has volume, he would be like almost your quintessential like dead zone running back. Like I can talk myself into the volume. I can talk myself into who he was, but that doesn't mean that that's going to equal points that are going to win me any leagues.
Think about him versus Javonte Williams. The assumption was that Javonte Williams had this multi-ligament tear, but then in the last top 10 takeaways, we bring on Deepak Chona, and he's like, well, no, actually there's a new technique where they can repair both ligaments simultaneously, and then it's a singular recovery schedule, and it's not a tiered recovery schedule where you have to rehab the MCL, then the ACL, and that's changed everything. And by all accounts, everything's going swimmingly for Javonte Williams. He's almost at an Adrian Peterson level recovery schedule. It's been amazing. And you don't have those concerns about offensive line in Denver. Things are much better positioned for Javonte Williams. So why would you take the risk of a Cam Akers where it's like, oh, this Javonte Williams is so risky? Yeah, well, actually, the underlying risk, the offensive line risk of Cam Akers has now superseded the health risk of Javonte Williams. So that's an easy slam dunk. You go Javonte Williams in that ADP range. This is how you ask the question. You want to know how offensive line can help you make fantasy football decisions. This is a great example. Give us one more team that you think is in trouble with their offensive line.
I don't really understand what the game plan is for the Tennessee Titans. I will give them credit. They took the 11th pick and they picked Peter Skoronski. And I will be the person who will sit here and I'll put my name to it. I think Skoronski can play tackle in the NFL because he may not have the measurables, but his technique is clean. I think they could have left him out there and he would have been kind of like Rashawn Slater, a little bit undersized, but he's so good at the technique that it doesn't matter.
Oh, no surprise. Rashawn Slater also went to
Northwestern.
Two Northwestern guys. They're experts at offensive line technique and hazing. Apparently, those are their best traits. There, the things that they know well. So they're going to be good hazers and great blockers. Skoronski, the most technically sound of the offensive linemen in the draft. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a reason why with his measurables, he was in the top 11. I mean, it's because when you turn on the film and you watch what he does, he doesn't make mistakes. He's always in the right places. And I mean, he's playing in the Big Ten, which has some significant pass rushers. I
Yeah.
mean, he's going up against guys like Lucas Van Ness and just stonewalling him on the line. And it's like, okay, like, for someone who's 6'4" with short arms, like that's pretty impressive because Van Ness is much longer than that.
So then, given this investment, you think this is a temporary event, a temporary move, that you're moving them down? They're going to be a poor offensive line in the year that Skoronski's a rookie, but they are going to bounce back once he gets some experience?
It's tough because they're trying Andre Dillard, who was a first-round pick by the Eagles years ago, never really found his way consistently into the starting lineup. He was supposed to be the heir apparent to Brandon Peters.
Right. That's also called a bust. Those guys are called busts. Well, he's a bust.
He's a starting left tackle in the NFL right now, Matt. He's a left tackle for the Tennessee Titans. And then you have Aaron Brewer, who struggled a lot at center. And I'm sorry, earlier I said Brandon Peters. I meant Jason Peters. Brandon Peters was a quarterback for Michigan and Illinois. I coached him in high school, so that one just popped into my head. Then you have Daniel Brunskill. He was a rotational guard for the 49ers, which he was rotational, and they let him walk and kept the other guy, so that tells you how they saw it. And then right now, because Nick Petit-Frere is looking at a 6-game gambling suspension, their starting right tackle is projected to be Chris Hubbard, who, if you haven't heard that name, it's because he's only played 400 snaps since 2019 with the Cleveland Browns.
This is a problem for Derrick Henry. This is a unit problem. This is not necessarily a pass protection problem. Maybe Skoronski's just fine. Probably not, though. And no one's drafting Ryan Tannehill with any kind of early ADP in any format. But the guy that's going early is Derrick Henry. And running backs need running lanes. It doesn't matter if you're a freak, if you're a unicorn, beast from mythology, right? Centaur. I didn't want to say centaur. I was trying to find a different one than a centaur because I called Rob Gronkowski a centaur of the vodka centaur once upon a time. But right, okay, so he's like a centaur, right? Okay, he's a mythological creature, and yet, you're going to see just a bunch of Derrick Henry going down behind the line of scrimmage, and not a lot of red zone visits. So good luck with that. Just good luck with that. Post-apex running back with one of the worst offensive lines on one of the worst offenses. Just hey, good luck. Good luck just drafting the guy based on his name and his history and his mythology. Good luck. Good luck.
Wish you the best. We all make choices.
Not me. Yeah, you don't have to draft these guys. This early draft capital is precious. I understand why you want to take shots on guys with upside late who are in tricky situations, but you don't have to draft the running backs behind bottom 3 offensive lines. You just don't have to do that. There's plenty of great players to draft. You don't have to do it. You can just say no.
But yet he's going to be drafted in the first round or second round of every home league everywhere.
Yeah, first round.
Name recognition.
Yeah. First round. Name recognition. Name ID. That's what it is. Okay. That may be the player. I think that's arguably he and Cam Akers are the 2 players, but the ADPs are very different, right? Where Derrick Henry, that's the scariest skill position player based on weaknesses along the offensive line. Give me the player that you think is teed up for success, and you think the offensive line is a big part of that.
I think you mentioned it earlier. David Montgomery. I think he is. So behind Chicago's just awful offensive line the last 2 years, he averaged 3.9 yards per carry. He had just 12 rushing touchdowns, and now he's the guy. And the way for me, I've looked at it in drafts because I understand Jahmyr Gibbs is getting drafted higher in best ball and all that, that's great.
That's great. Good for him.
And I understand a path can get him there, but also I think David Montgomery is going to out-touch him. He's going to get all the red zone touches. He's going to be running behind an offensive line that, for someone who isn't explosive like him, he's not going to be touched for his first. And so he's going to be able to get up steam and maybe break more tackles or maybe make that one cut. And we may see him with more explosive runs, not because he got more explosive, just because he doesn't have to dodge somebody in the backfield every time he touches the ball.
It feels gross, and one of the reasons it feels gross is because he's been in an impossible situation because of the offensive line for so many years in Chicago. We've talked about how degraded it was and how much they've improved in Chicago just in the last year. And David Montgomery's not going to be able to benefit from that. Instead, he went on warp speed to one of the best offensive lines, according to Dan Fornek, number 2 in the sport. So he's like, you know what? I don't want to wait around for this offensive line to get better. And I was in an expert draft, the Deep End Invitational. Who takes David Montgomery in those middle rounds, the value rounds where it's just boom, Montgomery, White, Pacheco, just so Dalvin Cook. There's just so many valuable. It's kind of like the next round after the traditional dead zone when you get round 4, 5, 6, and then when you get into round 7, some of these options they're just perfect, and some of them do not feel good. They're not shiny toys. They're not Derrick Henry, right? But they're in a better situation, and it's very possible. It's very possible. In fact, offensive line-based analysis, if you had an offensive line-based hot take, it would be David Montgomery outscores Derrick Henry this year. That's an offensive line-based hot take.
Yeah, and they can, and for all we know, it could happen. That I can't understate how many questions the Tennessee Titans offense has based on their offensive line coming into this year. And it's concerning because, Derrick Henry, as you said, unicorn centaur, he could be whatever you want him to be, but he needs to get momentum going, and he just may not have those lanes this year. And you're really, really projecting and hoping that Andre Dillard wasn't the issue in Philadelphia. He just wasn't as good as Jordan Mailata, who played rugby for most of his life before they discovered him. He's only been playing football for like 4 years, but he was better than Andre Dillard. You're hoping that Daniel Brunskill, the guy who in an offensive line rotation with the 49ers, the team said, we'll let this guy go and we're going to keep the other one. You're hoping that everybody but you is wrong. And in life, that's usually a pretty bad bet to make, that everyone but me is wrong.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All In package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you, especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.